Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for watching this mini lecture that I have prepared for you guys on sports diplomacy. Give me a second. I have a little PowerPoint to accompany this. Let's see. Share. Okay, fantastic. All right, here we go. So, as you can see, I'm wearing my France national soccer team jersey. I thought that might have been appropriate for this discussion. So in this mini lecture, I'm just going to give you sort of a brief, basic understanding of sort of the main themes regarding the role of sports in international affairs that we have learned or that I have learned in doing my reading, as well as some of the research for my final paper. So what I'm going to do is sort of start with an overview of the concept of sports diplomacy and how it is sort of a fluid concept, evolving and changing as policymakers seek to use different goals. And so they use different tools, I guess, to achieve different goals. Recently, the concept of sport diplomacy, I think, has become something that scholars, at least in the field, have sought to use more and gain a better understanding of, especially regarding some of the developments that we will discuss in our lecture. So without further ado, we'll get into it. A brief historical overview of the concept of using sports in international affairs. I think it can be sort of surmised as sports provide a way for building bridges between different cultures and different nations. And this concept is nothing new. I think it's something that policymakers have long maybe sought to exploit, maybe without fully knowing how or what outcomes can come from this. But dating back to even the original Olympics in ancient Greece, this was obviously the Olympics still go on today, and I think we all know what they are. But in ancient Greece, especially when warring city-states, you have to keep in mind a lot of these states are in perpetual conflict with one another. They would sort of put their differences aside to gather for areas of sport and friendly competition. And they did this once every 4 years, obviously. And again, it was a way that for these states, which historically did not get along, to I guess, maybe understand more of what they had in common than their differences. Another prominent example that I'd like to point out is what was called ping pong diplomacy in the 1970s between the US and China. If you've seen Forrest Gump, the movie, I think you kind of understand what this is, but nonetheless, this was a term coined by Henry Kissinger in his, under the Nixon administration, their attempts to build and establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And one way they did that was by sending a U.S. ping pong delegation to, compete and engage in friendly competition with the Chinese, knowing that ping pong is a sport that was or table tennis, if you will, was a sport that was enjoyed a lot in the PRC. And again, this sort of provided a way for the United States and China to maybe understand a bit more about their similarities in culture, despite the Cold War realpolitik, which tended to dominate the discussion. And obviously, this was successful because as we know, relations under Nixon were established with China. And so again, this was an example of something concrete that has come out of a sports diplomacy initiative. Another example that I think is worth discussing was the visit of Dennis Rodman, the ex-NBA player, to North Korea in the early 2000s after Kim Jong-un took power of the country following the death of his father, Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-un was a big sports fan and invited Dennis Rodman to come to the country, which I think allowed for the creation of a dialogue or the potential for a future dialogue between the two countries. And then finally, another prominent example, I think, that we can see of this in terms of sport as maybe a way of cooling tensions could be between India and Pakistan as they compete, I think, almost annually in cricket games, whether this be in a international tournament like the Ashes or Cricket World Cup, but also correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that they compete on almost an annual basis, which again could be a way of establishing and appreciating some common aspects of the culture between the two nations, which, as we know, have historically not really got along. So now that that's some examples of prominent successes in sport diplomacy, I'm going to continue in the presentation to talk about not only sports as a way of cooling down tensions, but also sports as a way of creating and establishing a national identity and pride. Then we will move into the discussion of the role of mega events, which I think is very important to understand, and the power that comes in that is associated with these mega events, both hosting them and performing well in them. And then finally, I'll move into something that has not been as widely discussed in the research, but the role of recently the soft power that comes with state-owned professional sports teams and state sponsorship of professional sports teams as opposed to simply international. Um, so sports, Victor Cha in the reading that we discussed attributed to attributed sports as a way of building national pride due to the emotional attachment that often exists between fan and team. Um, Obviously, I am a large sports fan, and I can say definitively that I do maybe have a bit too much of emotional attachment to the teams that I like and that I root for. I know, for example, that if I spend 3 hours of my day watching my team get rolled, it will, in fact, maybe put me in a bad mood for the rest of the weekend. So I can definitely appreciate this emotional aspect. But historically, sports teams on a national level that compete against international is not only a way to create national identity, but it's sort of a way to show off your culture and show off your way of life. But in sticking with the creation of national identity, I think one of the most prominent examples of this being done is, as you can see in the slide, was the success of the South African rugby team in the World Cup in the 90s, which was something that was done under the Mandela years. South Africa was the host of this tournament. And also this was done sort of in the wake of apartheid and the fall of the apartheid regime, where there was a lot of uncertainty about the future of the country and race in the country primarily. Traditionally, Black athletes had been excluded from these teams, but the fact that Mandela incorporated and actually encouraged a mixed race team, I guess, sort of gave the South Africans something to be proud of and something to hold on to as they move forward without the oppressive regime of the apartheid and obviously all the uncertain race relations that were present at the time. So I think another example that we can see of these teams using and national pride being created is the recent success of France in the Soccer World Cup. Given that most of their players were actually members of the French team from the African diaspora, sort of again sought to highlight in the country a sense of national pride and a sense of national unity, especially considering, again, some of the racial tensions that had been bubbling under the surface as immigrants, largely from perhaps Muslim nations, came in and settled in France. And again, it gave and allowed France to temporarily put aside these ethnic differences, rally around the flag and the national team, and obviously winning it helps a lot in this regard as well. And then finally, another example that can be used is on the flip side of that as a way for perhaps smaller nations within a larger group to have some sort of sense of pride and identity. And I think the example that I'll give for this is in the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales actually all compete internationally without Great Britain. And these sports teams are often independent or excuse me, the governing bodies, the football associations, if you will, sticking with soccer, but also in terms of rugby, is a way for the Scottish, the Welsh, the Northern Irish to maybe distinguish themselves from the English and from the United Kingdom, and I guess hold on to that sense of national pride and national identity. So clearly, nation building can be achieved through sport because, again, like I said, the emotional attachments that are created when you watch your team do well or do poorly. And it, and again, creates almost a unifying sense, at least for the term or the duration of whatever competition you are cheering for. So that provides us a nice segue into the role of these mega events, which can serve as a way of nations building soft power through a multiple avenues. So mega events often are including obviously the Olympics, the FIFA World Cup, the Rugby World Cup, the Ashes for cricket, UEFA Euros, the Copa America in South America, which is, I guess, these mega events give nations soft power through a couple of ways. The first is through the fact that by hosting a mega event, I'll talk about hosting first. Hosting mega events is something that many state governments will seek to capitalize on and will seek to court because it basically gives your country a global audience that you would not otherwise have, and a way to sort of put out a message or put out a feeling or a message to the international community regarding, what your country stands for, your culture, the success of an event. And there are several ways that soft power can be exercised through hosting a mega event. Obviously, the economic aspects of it cannot be ignored either. The amount of tourism that would come through hosting the Olympics or a FIFA World Cup cannot be denied. But sticking with our theme of soft power, hosting a mega event or being awarded a mega event will give nations a sense of international prestige that comes with, I guess, showing the world your ability to pull off something like this effectively. And this can kind of work both ways. Cha, in his reading, sticking with him, talked about the sort of outsized role that Australia has received as a global power due to the fact that it's hosted the Olympics more than once. I think Melbourne and Sydney both have hosted Olympic Games. Obviously, I think. But anyway, his sort of argument was that Australia, traditionally, if you look at a hard power role, is a regional power at best, dominated, of course, by a much larger neighbor in China and India, I guess, in that Southeastern Asia region and Oceania. But the fact that Australia has had and successfully executed these mega events has actually turned into more tangible diplomatic results and power results, insofar as that Australia maintains a special relationship with the United States. Australia is often consulted as a global power, perhaps a bit above its means on the surface, if you will, mainly because there's a status that comes with being able to successfully host a mega event. Again, Vladimir Putin famously said after Russia was awarded the 2014 Olympics that Russia was back as a global player on the international stage. And of course, the Rio Olympics and the Rio World Cup in Brazil, again, sort of, I guess, marked the arrival of Brazil as a regional power in the Western Hemisphere, something that traditionally had been dominated by the United States. But the fact that Brazil was able to host these events, I guess, gave them a sense of prestige, again, that comes with this. So we've talked about the way that mega events can provide international prestige, but they also, again, can give you the opportunity to showcase your culture to the world. This is a picture from the opening ceremonies of the 2012 Olympics, where these opening ceremonies often, again, provide a way for nations and governments to show off their culture and show off their values to a global audience. I think the Olympic opening ceremonies are one of the most widely watched things in the world. So, of course, using these and using that to brand your place, not only, but again, sort of promote your values of your society and your style of governance to the world, is something that is often done as well. So this brings us into the role of the national teams themselves in these mega events. As discussed earlier, success of a national team can be a good way to build national pride and build an emotional connection. But also, it can, on another level, to foreign audiences, serve as a way to build attraction and soft power by extension. For example, the United States has historically done very well in the Olympics, largely due to some of the laws that we have regarding equality of gender in the competition. So our medal count is always very high because United States society encourages through things like Title IX equality in sport, which again gives us tangible benefits on the international stage. And seeing the Americans on the top of the podium, hearing the national anthem played, gives global audiences maybe a sense of attraction again towards the United States, which can be used um, to build that soft power. And then conversely, I think it can also damage can be done as well. And I think the most prominent example of this that I can think of is the Russian doping scandal that came about um, around 2015-16, where basically it ended up with Russia being disqualified from participating in the Olympics after a large cheating scandal and systemic cheating scandal was overcome by an international journalist. If you don't know what I'm talking about, there's a great Netflix documentary called Icarus, um, which kind of explains this dynamic. So now that we understand the role and the power that hosting mega events and success in these mega events can bring, it brings us to discuss the role of non-state actors that can award these events that they have in international affairs. They can also non-state actors, whether it be the IOC, FIFA, Federation International, you know what FIFA is. But these non-state actors can almost act as kingmakers to states by awarding them these competitions. Obviously, Australia was discussed as an example of perhaps a state that has a bit more influence on the world stage than maybe it deserves. One reason could be because the IOC has awarded these competitions to Australia, allowing them to have a way to exercise and project their culture and values to the world. Unfortunately, some of these international non-state actors have been historically plagued with corruption. FIFA is a prominent example of that. And the awarding of the 22 World Cup to Qatar was something that was exposed as being largely funded by underhand cash exchanges between the Qatari government or the Qatari government and FIFA. But nonetheless, it has allowed Qatar to have this event, which again, a nation, a small regional power, if that, of 300,000 people will get a global audience for at least 2 months, despite the fact that they are, an authoritarian state with questionable human rights record. But nonetheless, they now have a large microphone to project a message out to the world. So understanding the role of these non-state actors and the committees that award mega events should also be appreciated as well. And this, I guess, moves into our last thing that I wanted to discuss, which is recently the professional sports, as opposed to international sports, have become another way for nations to seek to use soft power and, I guess, build a national brand and national image. So state-run enterprises will often sponsor professional sports teams due to, again, the fact that the global audience that these sports teams have, as well as, like I said, the emotional connection between fan and team. So here's an example you can see on the screen of Arsenal Football Club, which competes in England Premier League. But they're a worldwide brand and they have followers all over the world. And as such, you can see two sponsors on that shirt. One is Fly Emirates, which is a state-owned airline, I think in the UAE, as well as Visit Rwanda, sponsored by their official tourism department. So obviously state governments advertising and attempting to create or bolster their recreational tourism industry is not a new phenomenon. But I think the fact that given the attachment that exists between fan and sports team, that seeking to capitalize on that is another way of, I guess, building a national brand and a national image, as well as so not only official government sponsored advertisement campaigns, but also state-owned enterprise, which there's a blurry line between the two of those. So that's what's been discussed as sponsorship and the audience that is given to international bodies through sponsorship, but also recently, and this is kind of what I'm looking into for my final research, has been purchasing of entire sports team by state-owned governments or not governments, but government officials. So one prominent example or two examples that I'm going to look at is the purchases of Manchester City and Paris Saint-Germain football clubs by members of the royal family of both Qatar and the UAE. Here in the example, you can see the picture of PSG players in Qatar in what was sort of a mandatory sponsorship campaign that was taken in 2018, where the Qatari government used PSG and their millions of followers worldwide as a way to show off their country and show off, their successes. Um, Critics of this have claimed that this is sort of a form of what was termed greenwashing, which is basically attempting to change and counter negative images which might exist of these places for whether they're traditional style of governments. I know, for example, of the UAE, their support of the Saudis and their massive human rights abuses in Yemen. But it can perhaps gloss over some of the more negative aspects of your country in a way to project a more positive and international image. So a lot of the research that I found, again, was in regard to the national aspect of it, but I think the professional sports and the soft power that can be awarded to states through using professional sports enterprises should be noted as well. And I also don't think it's a coincidence that the government of Saudi Arabia is again looking to invest in a prominent European football team as well. Excuse me. So that's a sort of brief discussion of sort of the state of sport diplomacy as we see it in the world today, and the effect that sport, both professional and international, can have on a country's soft power. So finally, here's a few discussion questions, things to ponder between now and Thursday's discussion. Basically is, how has the concept of sport diplomacy evolved over time? How can we expect to perhaps see changes in this moving forward? While sports can serve as a means to create attraction in foreign audiences, how often have they been used to achieve concrete policy ends? I gave the discussion of ping pong diplomacy because I thought it was a prominent exception. Obviously, diplomatic visits, could be accompanied by viewing a sports game, but it's hard to draw a line between the role of sport and the hard policy outcome. And again, I think the example of ping pong diplomacy in the 1970s is perhaps an exception to that rule. And then finally is, why have these Gulf states sought to invest not only in their international teams, but in their professional teams as well? Some have said it's an economic motivation because they're realizing that as the world is moving off oil and attempting to become more carbon neutral, their main moneymaker for their economies is on a time limit, so they need to diversify. Or are there perhaps other political motivations that are at play as well? So thank you for getting all the way to the end of the lecture. I look forward to our discussion. And yeah, please don't feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.